There is a strange paradox in global geopolitics. When two countries are firing missiles at each other in the Middle East, the person who might benefit the most could actually be sitting thousands of miles away, inside the Kremlin. If you step back and look at the bigger picture, something interesting begins to emerge. The war involving Iran is not only shaking the Middle East, it may also be quietly reshaping the global energy market and possibly even influencing the direction of the war in Ukraine. And that raises an important question. How could a conflict that seems geographically distant from Russia end up turning Vladimir Putin into one of its biggest beneficiaries? If you understand the deeper logic behind these events, you begin to see how the world really works, not through political speeches or press conferences, but through the flow of energy, money, and strategic leverage. Just a little over a week ago, Russia's economy was facing serious pressure. Oil prices had been relatively weak, Western sanctions were tightening, and on the battlefield in Ukraine, Moscow had achieved very few decisive breakthroughs. Energy exports, which serve as the financial backbone of the Russian state, were increasingly constrained. Because Russian oil was being sold at steep discounts due to sanctions, government revenue had begun to decline. Over the past year, many Russian energy companies struggled to maintain profitability. Some smaller firms were even facing the risk of bankruptcy. At the same time, the Russian state budget was coming under mounting strain. Military operations in Ukraine require enormous funding every month, and declining energy income made that burden even heavier. But then, something unexpected happened. A new war erupted in the Middle East. The confrontation involving the United States, Israel, and Iran was not simply another regional conflict. Almost immediately, it sent shockwaves through the global energy system. And from that moment on, the dynamics began to shift. One of the first flashpoints in this crisis was the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is one of the most critical energy corridors in the world. Nearly 20% of the planet's oil supply passes through it every single day. When attacks on oil tankers began to occur, shipping traffic through the region slowed dramatically. Many companies became reluctant to send vessels through such a dangerous route. Within days, global energy markets started to feel the impact. Oil prices surged. Brent crude futures, the global benchmark for oil prices, began climbing rapidly. By the beginning of the week, prices had crossed the $100 per barrel mark. That was the first time oil had reached that level since 2022. And ironically, one of the countries benefiting most from that surge was Russia. For Moscow, high oil prices are almost always good news. For decades, the Russian economy has relied heavily on energy exports. Oil and natural gas generate a massive share of the country's foreign currency earnings. Those revenues not only support government spending, they also finance many of Russia's strategic initiatives around the world. Over the past year, however, low global prices and heavy sanctions forced Russia to sell oil at significant discounts. That meant less income flowing into the Kremlin's treasury. But when the Middle East conflict disrupted global supply, the market suddenly began to view Russia differently. Russia quickly became an attractive alternative source of oil. Major importers such as China and India began looking to Russian crude as a relatively stable supply compared to the increasingly volatile situation in the Middle East. As a result, the price gap between Russian oil and international benchmarks began narrowing rapidly. In fact, recent reports suggest that some shipments of Russian crude arriving in Indian ports have been sold at higher than usual prices. In other words, when Middle Eastern supply becomes uncertain, Russian oil starts to look like a safer option for many buyers. But the benefits for Moscow go further. The crisis has also triggered major disruptions in the global natural gas market. Following attacks on energy infrastructure connected to Qatar, one of the largest exporters of liquefied natural gas in the world, gas production there was temporarily halted. Qatar accounts for nearly 20% of global LNG trade. When that supply suddenly becomes unstable, markets react immediately. Natural gas prices in Europe surged. At the Dutch TTF gas trading hub, the continent's benchmark market, prices jumped nearly 40% in a single day. Within 24 hours, that increase approached 50%. Some analysts estimate that if the Strait of Hormuz were completely closed for a month, European gas prices could rise by as much as 130%. For many Europeans, this brings back memories of the severe energy crisis in 2022. And under those conditions, a difficult question begins to emerge inside the European Union. Can Europe continue to completely ban Russian energy if energy prices start skyrocketing again? Meanwhile, as the world focuses on military developments in the Middle East, Russia appears to be gaining strategic breathing room. The attention of the United States and Europe is increasingly divided. Military resources, diplomatic energy, and media coverage are shifting towards the Middle East crisis. As a result, the war in Ukraine has temporarily moved into the background of the global conversation. For Moscow, that creates valuable time. And Vladimir Putin's strategy has long been quite simple: extend the timeline, avoid major concessions, and wait for the opponent to grow tired. There's also another dimension to this situation: diplomacy. In recent days, Putin has begun presenting himself as a potential mediator between Iran and the West. According to several reports from Kremlin sources, during a phone call with Donald Trump, Putin suggested a political roadmap aimed at reducing tensions in the Middle East. If Russia can position itself as part of the solution to the crisis, it could gain significant diplomatic leverage. And that leverage might later be used in a much larger negotiation, the negotiation over Ukraine. When you step back and examine the entire picture, a fascinating geopolitical paradox appears. Two sides are fighting in the Middle East, but one of the biggest beneficiaries might be sitting thousands of miles away, inside the Kremlin. And if this trend continues, the war involving Iran may not only reshape the Middle East, it may also influence the future trajectory of the war in Ukraine and potentially alter the balance of power in global politics for years to come.